There's a question that the world's most advanced genetic laboratories have been quietly wrestling with for over 2 decades, and the answer they finally arrived at is not the one anyone expected. It does not sit comfortably. It does not wrap up neatly. And the more carefully you examine what the ancient DNA is actually saying, the more disturbing the picture becomes. Not just about Neanderthals, but about the deepest, darkest chapters of what it means to be human. Most people believe the Neanderthal story is essentially settled. We know they existed, we know they went extinct, we know that somewhere along the way they crossed paths with our ancestors, there was interbreeding, and today most people outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry roughly 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA scattered through their genome. We treat this as a fascinating footnote. Ancient history, literally. But what the newest generation of ancient DNA research is revealing about Neanderthal women specifically tears that comfortable narrative apart. What the bones are telling us, what the chromosomes are screaming at anyone willing to read them carefully, is a story so layered with violence, erasure, and biological consequence that it reframes everything we thought we understood about our own origins. Let us start where the science starts, with a silence. There is a part of your genome, if you are of non-African ancestry, that is almost completely empty. Not sparse, not reduced, nearly erased. The X chromosome, which women carry 2 copies of and men carry 1, should contain traces of Neanderthal ancestry, just like the rest of the genome. But it does not. Geneticists have known about this anomaly for years. They called the gaps Neanderthal deserts, vast stretches of the X chromosome where Neanderthal DNA simply does not exist in modern humans. The working assumption for a long time was straightforward. Those Neanderthal genes were biologically toxic. They caused developmental problems, reduced fertility, created incompatibilities that natural selection quietly and ruthlessly eliminated over thousands of generations. Case closed, scientists thought. Move on. But here is where it gets complicated, because the case was never actually closed. A paper published in the journal Science on February 26, 2026, by researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, Alexander Platt, Daniel Harris, and Sarah Tishkoff, reopened everything. They did not just revisit the old data, they did something nobody had thought to do with sufficient rigor. They looked at the X chromosomes of the Neanderthals themselves, and what they found there was not what the toxic gene theory would have predicted. Not even close. According to the study, the Neanderthal X chromosomes they analyzed showed an enormous surplus of modern human DNA, approximately 62% more than would have been expected relative to the rest of the genome. Let that sink in. Where modern humans had a Neanderthal desert on their X chromosomes, Neanderthals had the opposite, a modern human surplus, the mirror image. And that mirror image changed everything. Think about what that means for one moment. If Neanderthal genes on the X chromosome were simply biologically incompatible, harmful to any human who carried them, then you would expect to see the same thing in reverse. You would expect Neanderthal genomes to have avoided modern human X chromosome DNA as well, but they did not. They embraced it. Their X chromosomes were loaded with it, which means the problem was never incompatibility. The problem was something else entirely. According to informed sources in the field of population genetics, the data points in one direction with unusual clarity. The interbreeding between our 2 species was not random. It was not balanced. It was systematically, persistently biased along one very specific axis: sex. The University of Pennsylvania team ran mathematical models to test every plausible scenario. Could the pattern have emerged from differential migration, where perhaps mostly female Homo sapiens crossed into Neanderthal territory? They tested it. Even in the most extreme version of that scenario, imagining every single migrant from our species was female, the math only produced a 1.3-fold excess of modern human DNA on the Neanderthal X chromosome. But the observed excess was 1.6-fold. Migration alone could not explain it. What fit the data best, what reproduced the actual observed genetic pattern with the fewest assumptions, was a persistent, consistent mating preference. Neanderthal males disproportionately seeking out and mating with modern human females, across not just one episode of contact, but multiple, across generations, across time. You almost couldn't turn the bias up high enough in the models to get the patterns we were seeing, Platt noted in the study. The bias was not subtle, it was overwhelming. And this is where the story stops being merely genetic and starts becoming something far more unsettling. Because we're not talking about 2 college students meeting at a party. We are talking about 2 separate species, populations that had been diverging from a common ancestor for roughly 600,000 years, encountering each other on the raw frontier of Ice Age Eurasia. Modern humans and Neanderthals are estimated to have separated from a shared ancestor around 600,000 years ago, with Neanderthals developing across Europe and Western Asia, while Homo sapiens evolved in Africa. When humans first began moving out of Africa, in waves that geneticists now trace back as far as 250,000 years ago, with a major pulse around 47,000 years ago, they walked directly into Neanderthal territory, into a world that Neanderthals had occupied for hundreds of thousands of years. And what the DNA tells us is that when those two worlds collided, it was primarily Neanderthal men and modern human women whose genetic legacies intertwined. The real story is what that means for the women on both sides of that equation. Consider the Neanderthal women first, because here is what the genetic record implies about them, and it is devastating in its implications. If Neanderthal males were consistently, persistently preferring to mate with modern human females, if that preference was strong enough to leave an unmistakable stamp on the X chromosome across thousands of years, then what was happening to Neanderthal women's genetic contribution? It was being diluted, sidelined, erased from the lineage, not through death alone, but through reproductive marginalization. Their X chromosomes, the very chromosomes that would carry the clearest signature of Neanderthal female ancestry, are almost entirely absent from the modern human genome. The women who lived through that period, who bore children, who survived one of the most brutal environments in Earth's history, they left almost no genetic trace in us. The men found a way to pass their genes forward, even if it meant crossing species boundaries. The women, for the most part, did not. But the genetic record does not exist in isolation. And this is where the story gets worse, significantly worse, because while the chromosome researchers were reconstructing mating patterns from DNA, another group of scientists was reconstructing something else entirely from a cave in Belgium, from bones, specifically from the shattered, cut, cracked, deliberately broken bones of Neanderthal women and children who died between 41,000 and 45,000 years ago. The Goyet cave system in modern-day Belgium had been known to archaeologists since the 19th century. Over the course of those early excavations, more than 100 Neanderthal bone fragments were pulled from the third cave, the Troisième caverne, and largely set aside, catalogued, but not fully understood. The technology to read their full story did not yet exist. Then, over the course of a decade-long research effort by an international team including scientists from the CNRS, the Université de Bordeaux, the Université d'Aix-Marseille, and several other institutions, those fragments were subjected to the full arsenal of modern forensic science. DNA sequencing, radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis to determine geographic origins, and virtual three-dimensional reconstruction of bones so fragmented they were barely recognizable as human remains. The study was published in November 2025 in the journal Scientific Reports. What it revealed was published with careful, measured scientific language, but the reality it describes is not measured. It is horrifying. The bones belong to at least 6 individuals. Genetic analysis determined the biological sex of the specimens. The results showed a specific, unmistakable demographic pattern among the victims. 4 of the individuals were adult or adolescent females of notably short stature and gracile, light build, smaller boned than local Neanderthal populations. The remaining 2 victims were immature males, a child and a newborn infant. Read that again, an infant. The bones of all 6 individuals bore the same kinds of marks that researchers find on the bones of hunted animals at the same site. Cut marks, percussion marks, deliberate fracturing. The lower limbs had been systematically selected, the parts of the body with the highest nutritional yield. The bones had been cracked open. The marrow had been extracted. These were not burial remains. These were not the result of a ritual. According to the researchers, the pattern of treatment was consistent with one interpretation and one interpretation only. These individuals were killed and consumed as food. But here is what makes the Goyet discovery different from other instances of Neanderthal cannibalism that researchers have documented across Europe. The isotopic evidence, the chemical signature locked into bones and teeth that reveals where a person grew up, what water they drank, what food they ate, showed that these women and this child and this infant did not come from Goyet. They were not members of the local community. They came from a completely different region. They were outsiders, non-local, which means somebody brought them here or hunted them down as they traveled through this territory. Quentin Cosnefroy, a biological anthropologist at the center of this research, stated that the composition of the assemblage, 4 adult females and 2 immature individuals, was too specific to be accidental. This was not random. This was not opportunistic scavenging. This was a targeted act. The selection of victims was deliberate and systematic, which is what the researchers classify as selective exocannibalism, the cannibalism of specific individuals from an outside group. What most people are not seeing is the implication of that word selective. If this were simply about hunger, if a group of Neanderthals were starving and consumed whoever was available, you would expect to see a random mix of ages and sexes among the victims. You would expect to find the bones of adult males, of local group members, of individuals whose isotopic signatures matched the local environment. Instead, you find the opposite. Females, children, outsiders. The targeting was precise, the victims were chosen, and the question of why they were chosen, why women and children specifically, why from outside the local group, opens a window into a world of territorial violence, intergroup conflict, and resource competition that most popular portrayals of Neanderthals have never even attempted to address. The timing of these events is critical. Between 41,000 and 45,000 years ago, Northern Europe was entering one of the most turbulent periods in the entire history of our genus. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, were pushing into Europe in significant numbers for the first time. Neanderthal populations, which had already been declining across their range, were being compressed into shrinking territories. Resources were under pressure. Climate fluctuations during this period of the late Pleistocene were severe, with rapid oscillations between warming and cooling phases that devastated the large mammal populations that Neanderthal groups depended on for food. And into this pressure cooker, this landscape of contracting territory, diminishing prey, and encroaching competitors, groups of Neanderthals were apparently turning against each other with lethal and systematic violence. The researchers note that the Goyet findings reflect what they describe as territorial tensions between groups that preceded the disappearance of Neanderthals in the region. This was not random savagery. This was a society under collapse, doing what societies under collapse have done across human history, finding the most vulnerable targets and consuming them. What this tells us about the social structure of late Neanderthal groups is something the archaeological and genetic communities are only beginning to confront. The evidence from Goyet suggests that Neanderthal societies may have had forms of intergroup conflict sophisticated enough to involve targeted raids, the hunting of outsiders not for ritual purposes but for caloric extraction. That level of organized violence implies social coordination, territorial awareness, and the deliberate identification of targets. These were not mindless brutes acting on instinct. They were making calculated decisions about which outsiders to hunt, how to process their bodies for maximum nutritional yield, and where to do it. The very cognitive sophistication that researchers have spent decades trying to prove Neanderthals possessed, the evidence of symbolic thought, of burial practices, of ochre use and feather ornaments, is the same cognitive sophistication that made this level of organized violence possible. And now hold both of these stories in your mind simultaneously, the chromosome story and the bone story, because they are happening at almost exactly the same time period. The interbreeding documented in the University of Pennsylvania study, the persistent pattern of Neanderthal males seeking out modern human females across multiple generations, and the cannibalism at Goyet, the targeted destruction of Neanderthal women and children from outside groups, these events are overlapping. The same 40 to 50,000 year window, the same geographic range, the same species in the same moment of crisis. What that juxtaposition suggests is something that no news report has yet been willing to say clearly. The experience of being a Neanderthal woman in the final millennia of that species' existence was defined not by the romantic image of two ancient peoples meeting peacefully on a hilltop and sharing a genetic exchange, but by something far more violent and far more structurally systemic. According to informed sources in paleoanthropology, the traditional model of Neanderthal human contact imagined it as a series of neutral encounters, meetings at territorial boundaries, occasional interbreeding events, gradual genetic diffusion. The new evidence forces a significant revision of that model. The sex bias in interbreeding was not gentle or bilateral. It did not represent Neanderthal women and modern human men contributing equally to a shared genetic pool, alongside Neanderthal men and modern human women doing the same. The math rules that out. What happened was directional, persistent, and demographically one-sided. Neanderthal women's genetic contribution to the human lineage, specifically through the X chromosome, the very chromosome that carries the signature of female ancestry most directly, was systematically eliminated. Whether that elimination happened through reproductive exclusion, through the kind of territorial violence documented at Goyet, through the compression of Neanderthal female populations into situations where they simply could not reproduce at replacement rate, or through some combination of all of these forces operating simultaneously, the genetic result is the same. The desert on your X chromosome, if you carry one, is partly the silence of Neanderthal women who did not survive to leave their mark. There's also the matter of what happened to the women who did carry Neanderthal DNA, the modern human women who mated with Neanderthal males, and whose children inherited a complex genetic legacy from two different species. What most people are not seeing is that this is not a heritage story, it is a survival story. The children of those unions carried immune system variants, circadian rhythm variations, and pain sensitivity genes that, in some cases, provided real adaptive advantages in the Eurasian environments their mothers had recently entered. But they also carried costs. Research published over the past decade has documented that some Neanderthal genetic variants are associated with increased risk of depression, blood clotting disorders, and altered inflammatory responses. Legacies not of genetic perfection, but of two partially incompatible genetic systems forced together by circumstances that had nothing to do with choice as we understand it today. What the ancient DNA also tells us, and this is the detail that academic papers tend to present in the most restrained possible terms, while the implication screams between the lines, is that Neanderthal women were disappearing from the gene pool at exactly the moment their male counterparts were most actively contributing to ours. The Neanderthal Y chromosome, which passes exclusively from father to son, was eventually replaced in all known ancient Neanderthal genomes by a modern human version, an event that happened long before the final extinction. But the Neanderthal X chromosome, which passes from mothers to all children, became a desert in the human lineage. The fathers stayed, in genetic terms. The mothers were erased. That is not a story about two species meeting and merging. That is something else, and what that something else actually was, whether it was violence or reproductive coercion, or the brutal mathematics of a dying population compressed by climate and competition, and the relentless pressure of an expanding modern human population, is a question that the bones of Goyet suggest has a darker answer than most people have wanted to consider. The Goyet findings, published in November 2025 after a decade of painstaking research, represent one of the most comprehensive forensic profiles ever assembled of Neanderthal cannibalism victims. The researchers combined DNA sequencing for sex determination and genetic profiling, radiocarbon dating for precise temporal placement, isotopic analysis to establish geographic origin, and virtual three-dimensional reconstruction to analyze bones that were in many cases reduced to small, heavily processed fragments. The level of technological sophistication required to extract this information from 45,000-year-old cave remains is itself remarkable. A reminder that the disturbing story written in these bones could only be read now in 2025, because the tools to read it had not existed before. And what those tools revealed was a selection process so specific that the research team stated it could not be explained by chance. 4 females, 2 infants and children, all from outside the local group, all treated identically to the deer and aurochs bones found at the same site, bones cracked for marrow, flesh stripped for caloric content, no indication of ritual, no indication of special treatment. These were, in the cold language of the isotopic and genetic analysis, consumed as prey. The broader context is where the final layer of this story unfolds, and it is the layer that ties the chromosome evidence and the bone evidence together into something coherent and deeply disturbing in its coherence. Between 40 and 50,000 years ago, the Neanderthal world was ending, not in a single catastrophic event, but in a slow compression, a tightening vice of climate stress, resource competition, and the increasing presence of a technologically and socially innovative newcomer species that was beginning to occupy every viable habitat in Eurasia. Neanderthal population sizes, which had never been large, were dropping. Genetic diversity within Neanderthal groups was declining, a sign of isolation, of groups that could no longer find unrelated mates within their own populations, of a species fracturing into pockets too small to sustain themselves genetically. The interbreeding with modern humans was, in part, a consequence of this fragmentation. When your own species no longer provides enough individuals for healthy reproduction, you encounter the other species, and sometimes the biological barriers between you are insufficient to prevent conception. But the pattern documented by the University of Pennsylvania's study was that B, the persistent generation-spanning preference of Neanderthal males for modern human females, suggests something beyond mere biological opportunism. Mathematical models demonstrate that this was not a one-time event or a rare accident. The bias operated consistently enough, across enough generations, to leave a statistically unmistakable signature in the genomes of people alive today. Something about modern human women was repeatedly, reliably, preferentially chosen by Neanderthal males over Neanderthal women. Was it physical, behavioral, social? The researchers are careful to note that they cannot determine the cause, only the effect. One can only speculate, Sarah Tishkoff of the University of Pennsylvania acknowledged. But speculation anchored in the data leads somewhere uncomfortable. Neanderthal women were being reproductively displaced within their own species, at the same time that their bones were being cracked open for marrow by rival groups. On both axes, reproduction and survival, they were losing ground. Archaeological evidence cited in the Science Daily analysis of this research suggests that Neanderthal groups may have practiced female exogamy, traditions in which women moved between communities to mate rather than men. If that social structure was in place, it would have made Neanderthal women particularly vulnerable during periods of intergroup conflict. They would have been the members of the group most likely to be found in unfamiliar territory, most likely to be outsiders. most likely to match the demographic profile of the victims found in Goyet's third cave. The women who traveled between groups for social and reproductive integration, the same women whose mobility was perhaps central to Neanderthal social organization, may have been the very women who became targets when that social organization collapsed under the pressures of a dying world. None of this is speculation dressed up as fact. All of it is the intersection of data from multiple independent scientific disciplines: genetics, isotopic geochemistry, ancient DNA sequencing, radiocarbon chronology, forensic osteology, converging on a picture that is deeply, uncomfortably coherent. The Neanderthal women who lived through the final millennia of their species' existence occupied a world that was narrowing around them from every direction. The climate was destabilizing. The prey animals were disappearing. The modern humans were arriving. Their own males were, according to the genetic record, increasingly directing their reproductive energies elsewhere. And rival Neanderthal groups, compressed into the same shrinking territory, were apparently willing to kill and consume outsider women and their children, rather than integrate them. That is not a story of peaceful coexistence or gradual genetic blending. That is a story of erasure, and the ancient DNA is the evidence. What happened to Neanderthals, to all of them, male and female, remains one of the most actively contested questions in paleoanthropology. They did not simply vanish. The genetic evidence confirms they live on in us, in fragments, in the immune system variants, in the pain response genes, and the sleep cycle tendencies that Neanderthal DNA continues to influence in modern people today. But the Neanderthal women live on in us differently and less than the men. Their contribution to the modern human X chromosome was nearly eliminated by processes that the newest research is only beginning to illuminate. And the bones in Goyet's third cave, the shattered, marrow-extracted, cut-marked remains of women and children from somewhere far away, are a reminder that the disappearance of those women from the genetic record was not a passive natural process. It was, at least in part, the outcome of deliberate violence. The question that no one is yet fully equipped to answer, the question that makes the next decade of ancient DNA research potentially the most important in the history of our understanding of human origins, is whether what happened to Neanderthal women was unique to them, or whether it was simply the most clearly documented example of something that has been happening at the boundaries of human populations for as long as there have been human populations to have boundaries. Because the disturbing thing about the story the ancient DNA is telling is not that it reveals Neanderthals to have been monsters. The disturbing thing is how recognizable the dynamics are. The compression of territory, the targeting of the vulnerable, the reproductive displacement of one group by another, the erasure of women from the genetic record while the men find a way to persist. These are patterns that echo across human history in ways that are far from ancient. The Neanderthal story is not a story about a vanished species that has nothing to do with us. It is a mirror. And the image in that mirror is one that science is only now beginning to develop the courage and the tools to look at directly. The bones are still being studied. The genomes are still being sequenced. Every new ancient DNA extraction from a Neanderthal specimen adds another data point to a picture that is becoming clearer and more disturbing with each passing year of research. What will the next decade of findings reveal about the lives of those women, about where they came from, how they lived, what pressures they survived, and ultimately what forces ensured that so little of who they were would survive in the genomes of the billions of people alive today? That question does not yet have an answer, but the fact that we can now ask it with evidence, with genetic data, with isotopic profiles and radiocarbon dates and three-dimensional reconstructions of shattered bone, means the silence is ending. And what is emerging from that silence, slowly, piece by piece, fragment by fragment, chromosome by chromosome, is one of the most disturbing stories ever written in human DNA.